Hello and welcome to Deft and Dorky. We're going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons.
Dungeons and Dragons.
Hello,
Hello.
we're back.
We are back.
Your camera's always all over the place. I never have it in the right spot.
Back again. Is this better if I'm over here?
There you go. Now I don't gotta move it. Okay.
There you go.
Yeah,
Back
we're back.
again.
We're going to talk today. We're going to talk about adventure hooks. Kind of ties in a little bit with the backstories that we did last week. First off, I guess let's just talk about hooks in general. What do you think makes a good adventure hook?
Sharp. Pointy.
Sharp, pointy.
Got-
Yes, hooks.
Got bait. Got bait. Yeah, are you talking about I guess this could be anything, right? But I think that there's scale and size. There's
Yeah, not only hooks,
individual
but arcs as well.
mini quests and larger scale storylines.
Yeah. So I guess with hooks specifically, I try to, obviously the goal is to make something that's intriguing to the players that they will then follow, and that is your story for the next however long. But when you're talking about your major, the overarching plot hook, or story of a campaign, do you think that it should intertwine to every other minor hook in a campaign?
I don't think so. I guess, okay, so I think the scope of your campaign will dictate this. If you're just we're just going to do a six session arc or whatever, probably not. That is the entire thing. But if you're doing stuff like we do, I don't know how many people play games like we do, because I was thinking about it the other day. It's do we have what episode was tonight? We just played
59, I think, 58, 59,
Yeah.
something like that.
I don't know how many people do stuff like that, but if you're doing longer form campaigns like that, I don't know that every single little thing needs to tie in. But I think if you are going to have a longer thing and you have players that are interested in that kind of longer format, I think it's good that you come back to a larger arc every so often. The things that you do along the way can feed into it. And I think at a certain point, your characters, your players probably want to feel like they're working towards the big thing.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, we're thrown in the midst of this massive conflict. And then maybe more occasionally you get this kind of side distraction that's oh, nice, we're not just fighting the war, But I imagine that it's beneficial to kind of have this maybe initially you have these different kind of hooks, if you will, and occasionally you throw in the big one. And the longer your campaign goes, it's more big stuff, big hook items with the rare mini one. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's one of the things that I still am trying to get better at. Is trying to sort of determine how much of one and how much of the other, and how much they should intertwine. For the first campaign, it was almost everything had to do with the big thing. There was very little outside that was, I don't think there was anything that was completely separate from it.
Sure.
Which I guess is okay if that's, well, that's not true. There were some separate things. Well, to a certain degree, I suppose. But everything was certainly tied together. Just as it would be, I guess, in a real world. So, I guess that's okay. I don't know. Yeah, I guess if everyone's having a good time, it's fine, but
if it's a video game, I think of these as mini games on the side. Oh, I get to do the jump rope mini game in this town because there's two kids and jump rope. You know what I mean? Like,
Okay. So yeah, I
but
guess
those,
when you talk about it that way, there were some more separate things.
yeah.
Okay.
So I'm, yeah.
So, were we going to say something else?
Yeah, well, it's kind of it's a different question. So if you want to see this through, we can. But this would segue, not even segue. This is like different field.
Go ahead.
So,
We can come back if we need to.
well, yeah, so you've been DMing for a while. Large hooks or little hooks? Like, is there something I want to ask about? Like, what makes a good hook? You know, like how do you bait your players? Bait sounds weird. Pique your players' interest, because like if we think about like, well, what makes a good hook? Like I think like it's interesting, it's inviting, it's engaging. You know what I mean? But those aren't like helpful. Like,
Well,
so
okay. So what I try to do is there's a couple ways to go about it. One is the backstory, right? If you mention something in a player's backstory, that's something that they're gonna be like, hey, I know about that thing, I'm gonna go get it.
Right.
So that's like a good place to start. And then the way that I try to do the bigger ones is to sort of build it up, like just drop little hints with different things that you're doing, and then eventually when you realize they're all connected, then it feels satisfying for me as a player when that happens.
Sure.
So I try to do it that way, but it's difficult to do well because as a DM you know everything that's going on, and your players don't get that perspective. So sometimes you have to be more blunt than you think you should have to be. Mm-hmm. But that's what I try to do, is drop little like, oh, you also noticed this thing, and it's almost like just a throwaway thing, right? Oh, that, like, someone might be like, oh, that's just for flavor. And then later it comes back. Didn't he say something like this, similar like to this before? And then the more you sort of get these things, then they sort of start tying together. And that's, for me, that's what my goal is as a DM, is to make enough of those that it starts to come together and the players are like, oh.
Yeah. So I got my initial question that I thought of was for you, like, have you seen big payoffs with some of these hooks that you've put out there? Like, what are the hooks that you felt like that was an effective hook in either this campaign or the previous one?
Oh man.
And you could think about it. We can go back to it if you want.
Well, okay, so this is a big one that you actually had a lot to do with, so I'll talk about it here. In campaign 1, Traylor was just supposed to be a lieutenant to the big bad for me. That was it. And then you came into the campaign, and I was like, okay, well, maybe you know this guy from before, and that way that gets you sort of in with the party. You can have something that guides the party, but he was still not supposed to be anything more than the guy who goes, I'm going to kill you, and then you fight. But because of the way that the hook was set up within your backstory, you took it and ran, and almost like believed in that he had some redeeming qualities, and ended up sparing his life. Yep. Which means that he shows up in the next campaign.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, that was interesting.
And there's still, like, that in itself is it's somewhat of a hook for this campaign. It's not anything that's necessarily supposed to be dealt with, but especially since that would involve metagaming. But I like it because of the metagaming. You guys all know there's something going on there, but we can't dive into it.
Yeah, there's been several times where we're just like, this dude was guilty of like war crimes, but none of us know that. So
yeah,
this guy's super helpful to us. Yeah. Yeah, I think there's like an element of like, so I think people really like this game for a number of reasons. Like, it's a fun system, I think, and I don't know a ton about very many systems for TTRPGs, but I think I have fun playing it. I think a lot of people have. Obviously, that's why we're able to make a podcast about it, I guess. But I think there's a collaborative storytelling that people really get into, and I think that if you're like designing hooks, if you can make whether you like, that's why it's cool to ask people to do backstories. Like, I can use material from this. But then secondly, for like your main hooks, like if you can tell stories that people would be interested in looking at or going into, I think that that's really important too. Like I DM two groups right now, and one of them was like my first legit campaign. And I was really excited about doing Curse of Strahd because everyone said good things about it. I really like Gothic horror anyways, yada yada yada. And I don't know that my players dislike that necessarily, but I think that there were probably better genres and stories that would be better suited for them and myself as a DM, frankly. But like, I think that there are narrative hooks that they'd be more interested in than Curse of Strahd, because they're mostly new players too, and I'm like the dark, edgy one of the four of us. So like, you know, like one of them's my brother, and his big introduction to D&D was like playing with some local guys, but also like he loves Dimension 20, and it's like, oh, so you want like a more lighthearted, like Rod isn't necessarily. He plays along really well and has a good time with it. But, you know, he's also cutting loose and making jokes a lot of the time, which is fine, but I don't know. So.
Okay. Yeah. And what I also wanted to talk about a little bit about what happens if your players don't take the hook. Because there have been some times that I've dropped things and they've just sort of been passed over.
Well, and let me ask you about that, because, like, I think a good follow-up question is, like, why didn't they?
Mm-hmm.
Because, I mean, like, if they just aren't aware, that's one thing. So I'm curious, like, were there times where... I don't know. I mean, I'm a player, so, like, if there was something I was blind to, I wouldn't even know that we necessarily dropped the hook. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I'm trying to think of any that were that. Well, the one that comes to mind is, there's a couple times with Ray. The first campaign, basically he found an NPC who like knew who his parents were, and Eric is like famously loves this moment, but he finds an NPC who knows who his parents were, and he's like, okay, but I'm here for something else. Which, I mean, that's when you get to players that are fairly new and sort of like, oh, I'm supposed to be here for a thing, and then they discover something else, maybe they aren't ready for it. That's just a thing that happens. That's fine. And then in this campaign, there was okay, so when Mouse gets into Tassarin's like workshop, there were all these like papers strewn about, and I sort of described that, and Mouse just sort of picks them up and puts them away without really looking at any of them. And that's fine. But
he's just forgotten it.
Well, it came up because at some point he went back in there to do something, and he's like, I'm going to start looking through those papers. And within those papers is where he started finding out that Tassarin has been doing work for the Aftermath. So that was a thing that you guys, I mean, you wouldn't have known what the Aftermath was at the time, but that hook could have been dropped a long time ago. That was there the whole time. So, and that was fine too, because it worked out because it came up again. So, and I'm curious to know what might have happened had those bits of information been swapped in chronologically to see if you guys would have been like trying to find out what the Aftermath was. And like, because that could have been a whole like its own thing, essentially. Looking for what that word means.
I mean, that's a good question. So in that instance, I mean, sometimes you got to know your players. Like, some people play this game and love puzzles and like taking notes and it like sussing it out. And I think other people over there that are super happy to like show up and roll their dice and like follow. Like I think you have their follower players, and I think you have your more like leading players. You know.
It seems that way.
Yeah, and sometimes I mean like this is one thing that might be. I'm not going to say it's advice, but it's something to consider. I think if you have large hooks that are tied into a singular player interaction, you're risking that like a large narrative hook being missed on because there's not going to be 4 people interacting with it. There's just one person. So like there's been times where it's just like I'm, as a player, it's like I'm not there or I don't know about it, and I feel compelled not to bring it up. Absolutely, which maybe I should. Maybe I should be like.
I agree with not bringing it up if you don't know.
Like player to player, like, are you going to look at that?
Yeah, you can be like above the table. Hey, what's going on over there?
Hey, did you look at those things? Like, you should look at those things. I want to know what's in those things. Yeah. And you can tell me to F off, and that's fine. But, like, I think you may have forgotten.
And talking about, like, not tying it too heavily into one character, it worked out. Like I said, all those things came out anyway. It was just, I was very curious to see if you guys would, like, try to investigate into that, but, like, know something about it before it shows up, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't know. Maybe you would have, maybe you wouldn't have. I don't know. But it would have. That's what it was there for, is to give you the option to try to investigate that before it becomes a problem.
There was one instance in this campaign that I thought was kind of funny. Funny isn't not like haha, but just like it was interesting that it happened that way. So like the assassination attempt.
Yeah.
That you put into this campaign, like. You've got 5 players or 6 players or whatever it is that just like are antagonistic towards the overarching government or like neutral. And maybe Mouse is like, oh yeah, like whatever. But again, as we discussed, Ray isn't super, how do I say this? Like he's not like gonna drive the bus when it comes to that kind of stuff.
Yeah, generally not.
So in this scenario, in Isaac's campaign, we've talked about this before, there's this government organization, if you will, or overarching bureaucratic organization that like kind of regulates magic, and one of the top brass got assassinated.
The top brass.
Yeah, and like my character like actively hates this organization, so I'm like, oh no, well, what's next? And there's a couple other of us that are kind of like in this range from like neutral to like disfavorable towards it. So I mean like we kind of, this whole thing happened, and I think there was stuff around it that we eventually looked into, like, oh, these boxes or whatever, we did look into this organization, but it was kind of like this moment where I was like, well, I don't really care to look into this because I'm glad that this happened. Like that's how it kind of went down for me. And so not to say that this is like error on your part, but it was like an instance where like a world scenario happened, and I hope that you didn't have too much like affixed to that potential hook, because I was super happy to be like, I don't necessarily care to investigate the Aegis because they've ruined my family,
That was, I mean, that's what came out of that is pretty much exactly what I wanted. Because I knew that no one was going to be like, oh gosh, we have to snap into action to help this. I wanted it to be like, okay, so, and then like other things are going to start to fall into place. Like who's going to take over this power vacuum? If you don't do anything, it may be somebody worse. Like you need to just to keep an eye on it. And then you found out about the aftermath, and your brother is, still working for the Aegis and has to deal with this new threat. I mean, and then the conversation that you guys had outside the aftermath, outside of Jensimar's house,
right,
was I loved it.
Yeah. I mean,
that's like one of the top things I like to DM for, is when I give a problem, and there's like, oh well, what if I like I really enjoy when my players have that analysis paralysis. For me, that's great.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it means that I've done something worth talking about.
Yeah, well, in this circumstance definitely is. Like, it was definitely a moral gray area, and we all had different opinions on how to approach it, which was good. I enjoy it. So, so when it comes to developing good hooks, like collaborating, doing things that pique personal interest for your players, identifying what they like and are into, I think these are important things to do. What if your player misses it? You asked that question earlier. I have learned, and again, I don't have a ton of DM experience. I think at that point you either have 3 choices. I'm going to dumb it down to that. 1, you could just kind of railroad them and force them down the path where it's just like, well, here's this hook and you are going on it. And I think conventional wisdom is that that's generally not the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
Not general wisdom.
General consensus.
General consensus, yeah. You can force it down their throats. You can let it go and move on to the next thing. Or, like, I don't think it's a bad thing to, like, check in with your players and, like, nudge them. As far as, like, not forcing, but just, like, just affirm that they didn't necessarily just, like, whoosh miss it. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. That's the thing that I try to do. I notice at times when you guys will be like, "Oh, well, maybe we should do this." I will go, "Okay, here's what you know."
Yeah.
And I'll try to insert, okay, all the things that you have learned about said topic. Here are the things you know, and then I'll say, okay, do with that information what you will, but just so everyone to remember everything, because the campaign's been going over a year, almost 2 years at this point. So here's the things that you know. And I sometimes I feel like I shouldn't do that, but I think at the end of the day, I think that I probably should.
I think it's good. Yeah, I think that, like, there's a temptation. So as somebody who's DM'd a little bit now, but played a decent amount, like, depending how much time passes in between your sessions, like, you're gonna forget. I'll tell you this, I don't know that anybody else in our group keeps notes. And you know what? That's fine, that's their choice. But if you're relying on one person's... But, like, you forget things, and your players... As someone who's DMing, like, Curse of Strahd is a complicated campaign. Like, I think that a lot of people would say that it's, like, probably not a good one for your first. Because there's a lot of moving parts to it. And I know what's important. Like, these are critical pieces of information. My players... As a player, you never, like, encounter the information... How do I say this? Like, there's a lot in these worlds that gets built up. And... as a player, it can be like sitting in a lecture for 60 minutes 3 times a week. And there needs to be these moments where the DM or the professor says, this is going to be on the test. Like, you should circle this in your notes. Like, all this information is beneficial. But here's the year and the date of the war that I'm going to ask you a question about.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't think that that's necessarily bad. I don't think that's also necessarily forcing them down like an adventure hook necessarily, but I think if you, like, hey, by the way, you have that key in your pocket from like 3 months ago, like, don't forget. I don't know, like,
yeah. And that's sort of the fine line, because I want, as a player, I want to figure those things out. Like, that's a big part of the fun for me.
Yeah.
But as a DM, when your players are not either not figuring it out or forgetting key things, I do feel like I need to step in and be like, okay, here's what you know. And I mean, I guess that's just kind of a thing that has to happen on occasion.
I don't think
I'm the note taker in Michael's campaign.
Yeah.
And it's funny because Michael has notes, but apparently he continues to misplace them. So he'll be like, what was that guy's name in the town? And I'll be like, oh, it's here, I have it. Which is the same thing I think you do to me when I'm like, I don't know who that was. And you're like, oh, it was this person. Like, yeah, that's who it was.
Isaac and I have, like, a running list of topics for these podcasts, and one of them that I've written down is, like, I want to talk about, like, how do you take notes? Like, how do you organize your campaigns? Like, how do you like? I want to get into. 'Cause I DM for an online group and an in-person group, and like I want to find something better than my Microsoft Word documents for like organizing stuff. So, if you're out there and you're watching this and you use something that you really like, let us know because holy crap.
I just use Google Docs. There's a thing called Obsidian,
I've heard of this. In
and
fact, I was looking it up.
it's supposed to be really good, and I've seen videos of it, and it looks really cool. But also, I don't want to move everything over to, because I've got. Oh, I can tell you, I've got 34 pages, not double spaced, of information for just campaign 2. So moving all that over to a new place seems a little daunting. But Obsidian looks super cool. You can set it up to where it looks like a D&D handbook, like the stat blocks and everything, with the colors and fonts and all that stuff. Formatting. You can set it up to where it looks like that, and it looks super cool. But it's not.
I'll also look into this.
Yeah,
there's something called Kanka, Kanka, that I have looked at. We'll have to. This is stuff we can come back to. It's free. Interesting.
Yeah,
easy wiki building.
Obsidian is free for non-commercial use. Yep. It looks super cool. I want to jump into it, but I also am afraid to, because it's new and frightening.
Yeah. Anyway, I do think this highlights a good point, though, is that like a player can't make a decision if they're not presented with it or don't know it's there, right?
Mm-hmm. So
I think.
Tell me what you look for in a hook as a player versus a DM.
Yeah, so. I mean, I think players are just wanting something to do, like things to interact with in the world, and they can present themselves in the form of like combat or like plot lines or bad guys or whatever, right? And I think I was thinking about this today. Like, I think that there's a time limit on people's like attention span or like level of interest with something. And so like as a DM, I've been thinking like, okay, from now on, as I structure my sessions, like let's say your sessions are 2 hours or 3 hours or whatever they are, like I think you could see when the light goes out of people's eyes as far as their interest level is concerned or whatever. Yeah. I'm like, okay, I need to make sure that we don't have a combat that lasts longer than an hour, unless it's like big and dynamic. I think dynamism is something else that we could talk about with this. By that I just mean like, it's not like, okay, I roll dice and then it's your turn to roll dice. Now it's my turn to roll dice again. Giving multiple objectives to things. Like, I think that's perhaps another topic, but yeah, I don't know. My interest gets piqued when it's my own personal stuff that I've like co-collaborated with, you know?
Yeah.
I also feel a little guilty as a player if I feel like, okay, I've been in the spotlight for a little too long, you know? Like, let's incorporate others.
Yeah, I've been there. It's definitely a thing.
The other thing that I'll say too is that, like in the first campaign, I felt like I was guilty of this, but like I've got this acting background, and like early on, you spend a lot of time focusing on like, okay, identify like what is your objective. Like that's number one whenever you're working through like a script or anything like that. Like, what does the person want? Because if you cannot identify that or write something that doesn't exist, then you don't have a scene. You don't have conflict. Like you don't have. And so like my character is like, hey, well, I've got all this stuff about Traylor. Like that's what I want to go towards, you know? So I think for me, if there's a clear objective that's placed in front of it, that is when I'm like, okay, I'm bought in. Let's figure this out. Whatever it may be. So like, for example, we went back to that earlier example of the assassination. Like that was in direct conflict with what my character wants. and then you introduced it in a new way that was like, by the way, there's now kind of a bit of a power vacuum. Okay, now this is interesting to my character again. Because like I didn't care before, but then this is a problem that actually would affect me in my life. There you go.
Yeah, it was meant to be sort of a devil you know versus devil you don't know type of thing.
Right.
And that's all I wanted it to be. It wasn't supposed to be a big epic conclusion or anything. It was just supposed to be that, hey, this is happening. And if you choose one direction, then the world goes in that direction. If you choose another direction, the world can go in another direction. The overall sort of arc is still sort of being, I want to say, hinted at. It's not, there's enough pieces there for like a Sherlock Holmes or something to figure out what's going on, but it's not a lot.
Yeah, like I don't know if we got that in our group. It's tough too. Like this was 3 hours, 2 hours, 2 to 3 hours of my work week. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
It's so, and if not everybody shows up, like we show up, but like there's nights when you don't feel it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, so, yeah, I think that like clear conflict, like I don't know, like things that I'm interested in as a player, like I want to have a good idea of what the things are. So like clarity, there's got to be some conflict where it's like, okay, either this morally doesn't fit well, or there is something challenging something else or whatever. Like I think that that's another important element to it. Like, I mean, a very basic example, like, oh, that dude is beating a child. Okay, I'm gonna intervene. Or like, this thing threatens to kill the world. It's like, all right, cool, conflict. And then resistance or a challenge involved. You know what I mean? Like, in some ways, it's set up like, okay, there's a game about this combat. Like that. There you go. But you could also kind of go a little bit more nuanced and be like, okay, we're gonna have an RP with the big bad because it's clear that we would die if we tried to do anything about it. Be like, oh, or like there's a puzzle involved. Like I think if there's clarity so that your players understand, if there's like this is bad and we have to fight against it or whatever the conflict is, and then if there's resistance to like, well, I guess I could just burn the paper and then it's all done. Like that's okay. Sorry, that's not enough of a. that doesn't make it interesting. You know what I mean? So.
Yeah. And you gotta, like, talking about like knowing your players and stuff. I remember you mentioned puzzles, which made me think of the first campaign before you started playing. There was the man, I don't even remember what it was called now. The place where the main like good guy NPC was, Urel.
Dude, I vaguely remember that dude. When I came in, he was a lot smaller of a part, I think.
She was getting all the people that were, she was communicating telepathically or whatever with all the kids who she could find that she thought would be targeted by the bad guys.
Mm-hmm.
And she was getting them to come to where she was so that she could protect them.
Yeah.
And without a direct invitation, there was a way for the players to get in, but it involved a bunch of puzzles. And by the end of the sort of puzzle thing, they were just like plowing through without actually like trying to do the puzzles, which worked for them. But I was like, okay, note to self.
Yeah.
Too many puzzles.
Too many. Yeah. Even after like the one shot that you were a part of, where I think there were like 3 puzzles or something like that. Morgan told me like that was one too many. I was like, okay, good enough. Or like break it up or something. I don't know. It was like back to back or something. Anyway.
Yeah, it's tough because like if it's, at least for me as a player, if the puzzle is satisfying and like if the solution is satisfying, I could do 100 in a row. But if you get to like the 5th one in and it's not as satisfying as the first one, And
Right.
I'm like,
Yeah.
why are these getting easier?
Yeah, and I mean, like the trick, like make it more satisfying, make it more interesting. Like that's what everybody wants, but like
Yeah, it's
how to do that?
very hard to
Yeah,
do.
you got to create concrete reasons for that.
Yep.
So, like, I'll say that you asked me as a DM, like what I want my
Hmm.
hooks to be like. Like, I want them to be. I want to create an experience that will be enjoyable for my players.
Hmm.
But, like, if I put something out there and they don't get it, like that makes me sad. And it's like I need to make sure they understand what was in front of them. And if they didn't, then okay, perfect. That's fine. Like we can fix that. We can remedy that. But if they did and they just chose like, like I don't really care about like it's really funny in this Curse of Strahd campaign, like my players there's this NPC that's supposed like you're supposed to be a little bit sympathetic toward them.
Hmm.
My players hate this guy, and I'm like, he he is going to ask them the big favor, and like in this campaign they're going to do it because there's not much else to do at this point.
Uh-huh.
But man, like they're also relatively new, so I think like new players are more willing to just say like, yeah, let's do it, because they haven't discovered that they could just do whatever the hell they want, you know? Like, screw this guy, we're going to go over there. It's like, thanks for not doing that yet, because like he's kind of the key to this working out. So
So
um
yeah, I think that like obviously as a DM you want like well, I don't know if it's maybe it's not obvious. You want your players to enjoy it and be engaged in it. What kind of like cuz I had mentioned that the analysis paralysis is actually very satisfying for me. Is there any kind of player behavior that is satisfying for you?
Yeah, I mean, like, I think that, like, when I see, like, when there is that level of discussion of, like, what do we do? Like, I think that, I mean, I guess I should ask you this. Like, when you say analysis paralysis, you want it to be productive conversation towards a means, right? Or a means to an end.
Yeah, I want it to be a productive conversation, but I want it to be nuanced enough to where it's not, oh, well, we just go kill the guy.
Right.
There's a discussion about it, and maybe some of the party is like, maybe we shouldn't kill the guy, and the other part of it's like, I think maybe we should kill the guy. And it's sort of a back and forth about having to weigh those options and the consequences that come with them.
I feel similarly. Like, I want a couple things to happen. I want to hear that my players are deciding between different options. So I feel like, okay, cool. I didn't just like throw them down a hallway. Like they're looking at 3 or 4 doors.
Mm-hmm.
That feels good. It also feels good if I've given them enough information on top of those options that I don't have to say anything for a minute or two. Like they can deliberate and go back and forth, and they have all the information that they have. Like, I love being able to take a step back from the table and just being like, cool, they're having a good time because they're discussing it. You know what I mean?
Yes, that.
So if there's enough information and enough choice and like they're engaging with it, those are like the 3 signs that I'm like, okay, cool, this is good. And that third one's hard, right? Because like you have to cater to your table. Mm-hmm. Like you can give enough information and choice to everybody, but you've got to pick the right content that is going to move them. So for example, like in this Strahd campaign that I'm doing, like there's minor spoiler warning, I suppose, and more of a content warning. Children are put in danger in Curse of Strahd more than I care to admit. It's like, jeez. And luckily it's one of those gosh, I heard this the other day. Like when it comes to like questionable content, like content that people are comfortable with. It's just like, I'm comfortable with this totally. I'm comfortable with this. Lines and veils, thank you. Yes. Yeah, perfect. A lot of the danger is like veiled, like it had happened, or like you don't explicitly see this. Mm-hmm. So like in this particular instance, like there's a part, and I don't want to give too much away, but there's a part where there are implications of children that have been in danger. And that is like motivating for my players. So I've got something that's going to push them and that they're interested, like content wise, like all of them are parents. So they're not just going to like ignore that. But the path to solving the problem, I felt like the book really helped me out. The module helped me out a lot. Like, there's a couple ways through this, and there was a lot of information given to them in that moment. So it's like, sweet. They're chatting about this. They're trying to figure out what to do. They're trying to figure out a way forward. They could do this. They could do this. They could do this. Also, they could save these kids or whatever. So I don't know. That's when I feel good, is when that's happening, and I think that those are like the three like pillars of like, if you've got those three elements, you got a nice salsa.
And then how do you feel about, okay, so obviously Strahd's a pre-written and my stuff is not pre-written.
Sure.
Do you think, because I'm assuming that you have added in stuff to Strahd that is of your own creation.
Totally.
Do you see a big difference in either how you go about it or how the players interpret it to things that you have written versus things that were pre-written?
I think that I'm less stressed about the stuff I wrote because I don't feel like this needs to tie into something that's already there.
Okay.
Like, along the way, if they do something, it's like I can move on the fly because, like, sweet, like, I didn't even come up with anything to address the like thing that you brought up, but I can make that up. So, for example, like the backstories that my players wrote for this, like, I've already woven in stuff for each of them. We've only had like 4 or 5 sessions, and they've already had a chance to interface and touch on stuff related to their backstories. And so, for me, I feel like that is easier to kind of connect to. But mostly, the other reason that that's easier is just like, Strahd, there's a lot of content and to keep in the back of your mind, you know. So, and we play fairly sporadically, so it's like, oh, it's, you know, there was a stretch where it's like, we haven't played in like 4 months.
I have to read this module every time we play.
Yeah, exactly. It does feel like this thing is 250 whatever pages. Like, I have forgotten 80% of it.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, I have tried to run one sort of longer term pre-written, and it was Tomb of Annihilation with some people, and it, man, just having, because for me to be able to run something, I feel like I need to know, like, I feel like I need to be immersed in the world, so I know what happens if whatever, you know, A, B, or C variable pops up.
Right.
I need to know if they interact with that in a certain way, does that do anything that's going to be outside of the realm of the 5 feet in which you touch it? And certainly, having written my own, that is a lot easier.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I mean, like, I think when you're keeping in mind the scope of the entirety of a campaign, like, the problem with pre-writtens is that there's a lot of pages and language that is just unnecessary for like the big picture, you know what I mean? So, like, one thing that I've done that has helped, I have like a 2-page Word doc that is like the script, if you will, for Curse of Strahd. Like, if Curse of Strahd, like, whatever it is, like, if there's 17 chapters or whatever, here are like the 3, 4, 5 big things to do or main points about that place, you know?
Okay.
And if they skip that place, whatever, then they can just scrap it. But at least I can refer to that and be like, okay, cool. Like, one thing I've wanted to do with Strahd for my own DM prep purposes is just take the map, because there's a map of all these campaign settings, right? And just like get a giant version of it and put it on a wall and do like red string conspiracy theory style. I'm just like, okay, here's all the stuff here, and it's connected to all that stuff over there, and it's connected to all this stuff over here, and there are these people here, and like put their pictures up there. Like that's what I've always wanted to do. Because like, I think initially in DMing, I've been doing a lot of these Word docs that are kind of very linear, and as a result, I've enabled my players to have less freedom just inherently, because I'm like, this line comes before this line, and this thing comes before this thing. And instead I want to say, like, here's this more non-linear fashion where it's like, well, if you go there, these are the things that you can see and interact with. So.
Yeah, I feel like part of that is due, because I had a sort of a similar problem when I was running Tomb of Annihilation, is like there's so much content in there, and some of it you're like, oh, this is a super cool part, and it is 100% skippable if your players, and so you're trying to like drop these hints, like there's really cool stuff right over there.
Yeah.
And it's, if they don't go for it, then it's gone, and you have to, like, especially if there's something that could be gleaned in that section about the overarching campaign, you got to like find another place to put that, and like maybe they already passed one of the places that you could have put that, but you sort of didn't nudge it to the front because you thought they were going to be going over here where it's cooler if you reveal it here.
Yeah. Oh, totally. Yeah. I've been watching a lot of like YouTube about like improving your DM skills and stuff like that. There's this guy that I found that I like. He's smaller. It's called Deficient, I think. What is this? I'll look this up real quick. But he had this thing lately on like exploration. He put Deficient Master is his name. He had this video not too long ago about like, hey, like there's all these rules for combat, and there's quite a bit of information out there about RP, but then like exploration is this like third side of the triangle of D&D, and there's nothing in the rules about it, you know, like and he talked about like how he, like, your players walk into a room or your players interact with sort of how he kind of like how he presents information in a way that funnels players in while still giving them the choice. And he's like, yeah, when I'm describing the room, like let's say you've got this like 3 or 4 paragraphs of like Curse of Strahd, right? He's like, I want you to take those 3 or 4 paragraphs and I want you to identify the things that are most critical for them, that is apparent, and then funnel it down into information that is important but requires engagement. Like, okay, you walk into a room and you see like this piece of furniture and a desk over there, and there's a chess table and there's a mirror. Like there's these 4 things I want to highlight to them, and of those 4, 2 are keys to like opening the secret doors in this room. And I'm gonna like give them the information. Like on the chess table you see that there's kind of like this layout of these pieces, and you can tell that it's black's move, and like if they're able to figure out the puzzle, then they can open up the secret door into the next room or whatever. Like I can't remember what the 3 were, but it's like very apparent, like can be gleamed, and then there's like secret, and like he never hides anything pivotal in like the secret level.
Yeah.
But he always affixes some kind of cool reward for engaging at that level.
Yeah.
And like the point being is that like the players are always at least told very blatantly, like let's say you're reading Tomb of Annihilation, you're like, there's something super secret over there. It's like, well, make that a top level information piece that you tell them and get rid of everything else. Because if you want to at least present them with that option, like make sure that it's there for them.
Yeah, and that's like it's hard to do that because it's necessary to do that, but it's hard because the things that you need, like your things that your player characters need to move on, are obviously the most satisfying to get because they need them.
Yeah.
So but then when there's like the something that would be in the sort of secret column, if you figure it out, there's not like it's tough to get it as satisfying, right? Because anything that you would have needed can't be there, otherwise the game is over. So that's like well, there's a couple examples actually. There was the Aftermath, right? because the within Tasserand's papers, you could have found that out. That was sort of a secret thing, and you could have found that out earlier and sort of gone into that. And then there was also, I don't know if you remember this, in the Feywild, Vonic sat in a chair and got a memory of these elves who were going across. He got it from the elves going across the ocean on these boats, and basically set up shop in the sinkhole. And then he came to this particular elf came to the Feywild and set up a house.
I don't remember this at all, dude. Granted, like, we did the Feywild, what, like a year ago or more?
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
It's been a long time, but I don't remember that from Adam, dude. So funny.
Yeah, there was, so you guys found a house out in the Feywild. Because it was like it was one of my things that could happen, and I think it was a roll of a dice, or maybe I was just like, yeah, there's a house, and then you guys actually went and looked at it. But anyway, you went in and looked at it, and it was like all mostly overgrown, except for there was this chair that seemed like moderately, like comparatively untouched by all the overgrown stuff. And there was a plaque in front of it that says, "Sit here and know me," or something to that effect.
Okay.
And Vonic's like, "I'll sit," and he sat, and like I think it was either like 10 minutes or an hour went by, and he was just sitting there unable, and you guys were like unable to raise him or wake him, whatever. And this whole time he's having this like lifelong view of this elf that came across the ocean from somewhere. They, like, a bunch of them set up shop in that sinkhole that you guys have been to, with all the, like, the portal nexus or whatever, and then eventually settled in the Feywild and built a house. It was just a little thing that was a side thing.
Yeah, and not like that. It's obviously not pivotal to the story, but it was like a fun layer. Now that I like, okay, yeah, I fixed that to that. Going back to your earlier question of like, I never think it's a bad thing to tell your players like, this is what you were doing and this is why. Like, doing recaps for them can be really beneficial.
Yeah, it's like,
so you feel like
any serialized television show last time on, and they'll show stuff not just from the previous episode, but stuff from a season ago that's about to get some new information put on it.
Yes, yeah. The other, because I mean, like, I think it's very possible for people to start straying from, like, you've got this like plot hook, they're on the line, and then like a couple weeks go by, and it's like there's deviations that will happen. Yeah. And I think it's okay to be like, you were doing this because of this, and as a player, the amount of times that I'm like, oh yeah, like here's the thing that's interesting. Like, I think people should DM and play regularly, because as a DM, that feels bad, and it feels like I'm also like, I acknowledge as a person, I am hypersensitive to like forcing people to do things. Like, I hate feeling like I'm spoon feeding this hobby to them. Like, these people that I've started playing with recently, I'm like, we don't have to play if you're not having fun. Like, just let me know. Like, I go too hard in the paint on that kind of thing, and they're like, Brian, we're having a good time. Just shut up. Like, just we will tell you if we think this is boring or bad. So the DM, it could feel bad. It's like, I don't want to force them, or I don't want to railroad them, or whatever. But as a player, like, it's so good to play in DM when you can, because like, I have never felt like, oh, this was just given to me. How cheap of an experience. 9 times out of 10, I think most players are like, oh yeah, that's right. Okay, let's go do this. You know, I don't know. Maybe that's just me, but I have never. I mean, I've been at your table for what, 3 years now? Pandemic is when it started, so at least 2020, so probably 4 years this year. And I've never felt like, oh, well, thanks, Isaac. You like took the choice out of my hands, and now this experience is cheapened. So,
I wanted to touch on, or go ahead.
The last thing that I'll say about like, what if they miss your thing? this deficient master, he has this thing called Schrodinger's situations or
Oh
Schrodinger's
yeah, yeah.
circumstances or whatever.
Hmm.
Yeah, and it's just like, hey, like keep a binder of all the shiz that your players skip because like you could just use them later, you
Hmm.
know? Like, oh, I guess they didn't go that way. Well, I'll keep this encounter in my back pocket for another time, you know?
Yep.
And not like quantum ogre stuff, but like if this fits elsewhere, I will do that.
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely.
what was the last thing you were going to touch on?
Oh, I was going to talk about adventure hooks for me from a player's perspective, and it doesn't have to necessarily have to be a hook, I guess, but just like one of the most satisfying times I've had as a player was in Michael's campaign. The David's character and Francisco's character were so. Francisco's character is like one of the older characters in the campaign because like I think everyone had died except for Eric, I think. But a lot of that happened before I was there. So David's character had recently died, as with me too, and he came back as a skeleton, but he had the ability to like make himself look like he's not a skeleton, so it's not super weird. It's only mildly weird.
Yeah.
But we eventually find out he's a skeleton, and like we go to visit. We find out where Francisco's character's like parents are from, and we've like we go to this place where people recognize Francisco's character, and he's like, I have no idea who these people are, and so all these little hints are getting dropped that like there's some kind of doppelganger out there, right? And we go to where his parents are, and I like went and Michael had mentioned there was like a graveyard. I was like, what's in this graveyard? And he makes me roll, and it's like, oh, this is the only thing that's, he mentions a few things that are of import. And I'm like, I start putting all these things together, and I'm like, I look over at Francisco's character, and I go, is Francisco's character the same height as David's character? And he's like, I don't know. It's like, if taking into account the fact that he doesn't have skin or cartilage, are they about the same height? And he's like, I don't know, make a medicine check. And I made it, and it was good. And he's like, they could be. And I was like, they're brothers.
Oh, jeez.
And I figured it out, and I said it, and then like later that session, we made that discovery, and like I don't know if Michael was truly upset by the fact that I figured it out before he dropped it or not, but he mentioned he's like, you go and ruin all the fun. But that was like that was one of the most satisfying experiences for me, is just figuring those things out from the little clues.
Yeah. Did those clues come in that one session, or had they been built up over time?
So a lot of the ones that took me over the edge were obviously that session. Okay. But there were like a lot of subtle clues. Like the doppelganger thing was from quite a bit earlier. And it was, like I don't even remember what the final clue was, and I was like, oh, but it was something in that graveyard. And I don't even think, what's funny is I don't think it was something he said. I think it was something he didn't say, that I was like, oh.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think I only asked that because I think that, like, again, players can't make decisions if they don't have the information. And I think that if you are trying to, like, thread the needle with something, with a storyline or a hook, and your players miss it, like, I think it's good to confirm if they have it, or two, like, when you present it, that it is, like, this is going to be on the test kind of moment, or in, like, a recency fashion. You know what I mean? Where it's just like, if you have something really big and there's potential that they're going to miss it, like give them the chunks in a single serving. You know?
Yeah.
Like if you can combine it as like, hey, this is going to be a big. We're not doing a shopping episode today. Like we're doing like a big reveal, like lots of plot points kind of session. And like we've had a couple of those in your campaigns where it's just like, whoa, like I've got a lot of notes to write down. Like the notes from this week and last week have been pretty sparse because it's like,
there's lots of combat.
Walking through the jungle.
Smashing the undead guys.
Exactly. Which is fine. Like those are fun. Like again, pacing is important, but so
Yeah. What's I don't. Maybe it's just me because I always have to try to figure things out, and I think it was 2 weeks ago in Michael's campaign. So there are these bad guys. Okay.
Yeah.
The overarching bad guys are called Nostra.
Okay.
And we met a couple of them, and like we sort of made a joke about it because one of them's name was Chain, one of them's name was Rain, and we're like, oh, they all rhyme with each other. Okay, some of them didn't, but like it was funny that some of them did.
Yeah.
And so a couple of weeks ago, we went to save this guy from getting killed by these elves, and he was like a guy from this town nearby that had gotten pulled out there, and when we got out there to save him, like webbed up and paralyzed was another guy from the town, and we like unwebbed him, and he was like, we did a medicine check. He's like, oh, he's paralyzed by it's probably poison. So I cleansed him of the poison. He starts moving around, and they're talking like, we got to get back to town. And we're like, oh, sorry, what's your name? And he looked over at a sheet, I think, just like a random name sheet. And he's like, oh, my name's Wayne, and I'm like a logger. And I was like, oh, okay. And we didn't think anything of it at the time. And then we went down to where we've had traced this corruption of this island back, and we found that there was a Nostra in there. And I immediately was like, I go, is there anything that would make me think that this is Wayne? And Michael's like, what? I was like, we know that some of their names rhyme, and Wayne was out there for no reason, just hanging out. And Michael's like, oh, man. No, I wish I'd have thought of that, though.
Yeah, there you go. XP to level 3 just put a video out not too long ago about like running a mystery type setting for your players.
Yeah, I watched that. That was great.
Stuff like that was in it, where it's just like, you think he is? I can't remember what the biggest, dumbest thing that they said was like, you think they're diabetic?
he died of heart disease, yes.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. So one thing that I think, like this obsidian, if it is what I think it is, but like Kenka, like that's something that I would like to use for it. I think that not only will it help me stay organized, but it can have something that's player facing. And so I can highlight the most important information and give them, like one thing that's been helpful for our campaign is like, as a part of my notes, I've made a quest log, because it's just like, we'll resolve a minor plot hook or whatever, or hook, and I want to return to that and be like, okay, what do we have to do? Like, what are we moving towards? There's always this feeling of like, what's the objective? Like, players want, again, to do something and something to interact with. Like, I feel like it's important to always like come back to this idea of like, what do we know? What are the bullet points that we know? And what can I do? So, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, my campaign has been very, far more sandboxy than the first one. So it's certainly got a lot of things all over the place. A lot of hands and a lot of different pies, I guess, is the way you'd say.
Yeah. It's been fun, though. But I mean, like, if you find that your players are missing things, this is just for out there, maybe some of these things can help.
Yeah, absolutely. Try, just, I mean, all you can ever do is try your best, I guess. So if you... But yeah, I think that covers a lot of what I wanted to cover, so if not everything. So yeah, there you go. Another episode of the podcast from Deft and Dorky.
Gotta come up with a name.
It's called the podcast. That's what it's officially called.
The podcast.
The podcast.
Deft and Dorky.
Deft and Dorky.
The podcast.
Yes.
We can't even, oh my gosh.
I needed a name for the playlist, and I was like, all right, it's going to be called the podcast, at least for now. Maybe I'll change
the podcast. Yeah, we will. We'll
Don't like it. I'm changing it. All right. Well, thanks for chatting with me. Thanks everyone for listening / watching. And we'll hope to see you again next week on Wednesday, where we're going to talk about some more Dungeons and Dragons stuff. Bye.
Bye.